Hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. So today a focus on immigration and asylum seekers and the impact on housing and our economics, the whole 9 yards. You might remember the words of the award-winning author, Canadian author Yann Martel. Canada is the greatest hotel on earth. And the bills are starting to come due because it's really true that we saw ourselves that way, that we were a nation of immigrants, that we embraced that, we loved it. But now, with perhaps too many impacting too many parts of our economy, I think people are rethinking this. So Mike Moffatt is an economist. He serves as the executive in residence at the Smart Prosperity Institute. Is that the right title? Or have
Yeah,
you?
absolutely. Yeah, that
Okay.
works for me.
I worked there for a long time, former professor at the Ivy Business School, co-host of a podcast called The Missing Middle. We'll get into what that's about a little bit later. But he recently went and attended a gathering of the Liberal caucus on the issues of the impact of all of this migration of people into our country. And it's been reported that he spoke truth to power. So we're going to see if he's going to
Yeah.
do that with us today. Welcome. Great to meet you.
No, thank you for having me.
It's great. So, where do we start? Let's just start with how we got there, because there was advice inside of government and certainly out, which said you got to think this through. If you open up the borders, there's going to be, it's not just people have arrived. Where will they live? Where will they go to school? Will there be enough hospitals? What will they live on? Jobs? Why wasn't anybody thinking this through?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I'm still kind of asking myself that sometimes. And when we look at the immigration system, it's really kind of two components to it. One is the permanent residency
Yeah.
component. So that's people who come over here and they make a life here. That
Legally,
part
they fill out the
legally,
paperwork.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, that had been at least somewhat planned out. Now that those targets had increased over time from about 250,000 to 500,000, but, in a relatively managed way. But the second component is non-permanent residency, which is a bit of a misnomer, but it's groups like international students, temporary foreign workers, and so on. I say it's a bit of a misnomer because many of the people who start out as non-permanent residents, apply for permanent residency. So it's a pathway. We've never had any kind of targets and until this year. We've never had any sort of plan that went through it. And what happened was that the federal government had encouraged the growth in the international student market and essentially left it to the province to sort of figure out all of the details, right? That they said, as long as you meet a minimum standard and a school will take you, you can come in, be an international student, apply after graduation to stay 3 years on a work permit and then apply for permanent residency. At its core, it's actually a really good idea of,
Yeah. I mean, the
having.
whole pitch was come and learn and study and stay. Like we were really
Oh,
obvious
we
about
were. Yeah, no, absolutely, and it really solves a problem that we've known for decades that newcomers to Canada, new immigrants to Canada, have trouble adjusting to the workforce, right? Like they have a degree or diploma or credential from a college or university you've never heard from. So the idea was have people come over at 18, go to a school here, spend 4 years in a college or university, really understand Canadian culture, learn English, learn French, and so on. And then that will, when they do finally get permanent residency, they'll have a much better pathway because they'll have a Canadian credential. But we didn't put any real controls on it, right? We just
yeah.
allowed schools, the federal government outsourced its immigration program to a bunch of community colleges all across Canada. These students pay $40,000-$50,000 a year to be here. So of course schools were allowing as many to come in as they wanted to. And the whole thing just kind of collapsed under its own weight because at the end of the day, like nobody was really minding the store on any of
Well,
this.
and a lot of these places were fraudulent in the sense that they entice people, but they weren't really a college. They were, maybe a room in an office somewhere. And a lot of these kids end up driving Uber.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Because you can understand, you're paying 50,000 dollars in tuition. Plus, we know how expensive Southern Ontario is,
Yeah,
and many of them are ending up in the GTA. They got to do what they can to survive. But absolutely, in many cases, the quality of education was relatively poor. That colleges in particular would cram thousands of students in a single kind of online class. Introduction to tourism, those kinds of things. Students would basically, learn when they can, go onto campus, write the occasional multiple choice test, and then there you go. So, they were spending 40, 50, 60 hours a week or more working either, in the sort of regular economy or gig jobs like Uber, skip the
yeah.
dishes, and so on.
So there's that whole category, and then we also saw a spike in what the government called irregular, but
Yeah.
what you would say is illegal. And this issue is about to explode again in the wake of the election in the U.S. about people going both ways across that border, using us as a backdoor to get to the U.S. or now in some cases fleeing because they know the government's coming from them. So we've got a big whacking issue here. Do we know how many of people in that category there roughly are? Of course, because they've come in an irregular fashion.
Yeah.
You don't have the official numbers, but do we have an idea, and do we know what we can do about it?
Yeah, so it's probably in the range of a couple 100,000, but we don't have a great sense of that, simply because it's really impossible to,
Yeah.
and what we have to do, I think, is make investments, when people make asylum claims, so we can get those processed quickly. Where if it's a legitimate claim, and some of them are, then absolutely they should be able to stay. If not, they can't. And I think what we're going to start to see is, I think, as the federal government levels back on the international student side, and they've already highlighted that this is a concern, that many of those students will themselves be making asylum claims, and we need to make sure that the government has the resources to process that in a timely manner.
Well, and for those that come forward, I mean, this is also leads to the underground economy too,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, no, it absolutely, it absolutely does, and you see that where people may be working in the gig economy, under somebody else's name or
Right.
those kinds of things. We know these things happen, and then they're challenging. Governments are trying at all levels are trying to do what they can to, eliminate that kind of fraud. But it is, the sheer number makes it a challenge to manage.
Yeah, I just keep coming back like it's kind of a what were they thinking? I mean, you've got to know when you open the door that people will come through it, and you have to be ready. I mean, I was sort of surprised, and I think you noted this in your remarks that some of the international agencies, the UN, actually refer to this as a kind of slavery. I mean, when you're bringing people in and they don't have a place to live or food to eat or jobs, like this is not good behavior. You're not doing anybody a favor.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and we've been called out by the United Nations on several occasions, particularly our temporary foreign worker program.
Right.
When you tie somebody's ability to be in the country with a particular employer, it gives that employer a whole lot of power, particularly if that employer is also the one providing your housing. So, if you do something to upset your employer, you both, lose your job, lose your home, and, have to get basically sent out of the country. That creates a really problematic power imbalance that the United Nations has criticized Canada repeatedly for.
And then the ones that are, I mean, I see a lot of these, I know a lot of these folks who do this in the
Mhm.
agriculture sector, and it is a routine. They're here for 6 months, they go home for 6 months, they do live in accommodation provided by the employer, but it's relationships that have lasted 20 years. They're not the ones necessarily trying to come into the country through the back door. they're kind of happy with the arrangement. But then when you start to see governments react, they're also the ones that get punished because they're findable.
Yeah, and that's a real concern that I have, is, now we've got governments kind of scrambling to address the problem, and whenever you design public policy in that kind of environment, you're going to make mistakes. So absolutely, I think we need to step back and take the time and go, okay, what are the parts of the system that are working well? Let's, protect that. Let's enhance those. And then there are other parts that aren't working well. Then let's address that. But absolutely, there are parts of the temporary foreign worker program, like parts of the agricultural program,
Yeah.
that are working relatively well.
Yeah.
And, that's not where necessarily we should be focusing our attentions when it comes to reforms.
And we have seen the government now concede that, that this was maybe a little bit ill-conceived, but it doesn't undo the problem that we've got people living in hotels. The numbers are really quite stunning, more than $1 billion in terms of shelter costs. People living in hotels in major cities, that is a huge cost to the provincial system, which been transferred to them, or even the municipal system. Also not a way to raise kids or live in that way, and also breeds resentment.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's, one of the really problematic parts of this is you've got some of the most vulnerable, marginalized people in the world who are, having to face this resentment. But it's, in many cases, it's not their fault. You're looking at people who are escaping war in Ukraine or so on. It's ultimately the fault, I think, of our policymakers who make, design the policies, design the systems, are in charge of the housing system, and so on, who aren't, reacting in a way, or basically planning. Actually, they are reacting, and
Yeah.
instead of planning, instead of going, okay, what do we want to do? Let's say again on the international student side, and how can we grow this in a sustained manner, and how can we create enough housing for everyone? Rather than just saying, okay, we're gonna change some rules, and whatever happens, and then we can deal with the consequences after the fact.
Well, and you're an economist. I know you know this, but I mean, they've given some of the money to provincial and municipal operations to say create housing, but no rules about the rules that would make building those or providing those pieces of accommodation, the housing, in any reasonable or timely manner. Also, the students that are here and may have been burned by the system or are caught in the middle of this also happen to be in areas where we're seeing high youth unemployment, particularly among young males, and that's never a good thing.
No, it really isn't. And I feel just awful for the students here who, were back home. They were recruited, over the last 4 years. They spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to be here with the promise of, one day, work hard, and you'll be able to get permanent residency, for all of a sudden the federal government to basically pull that back, and then people blaming them for the unemployment situation. It's not the job of an 18-year-old kid overseas to make sure that our labor market system works and our housing market works and so on. That's the role of our governments, particularly our federal government. So it is highly problematic that we are exploiting all of these great young people with a dream, and getting them to come over and taking hundreds of thousands of dollars from them, and then blaming them when the system blows up.
So again, I don't think people intentionally go out to do this, or at least I hope they don't, although the theory abounds that a lot of the people that were brought in, there was some misguided notion that this was going to change the voter base, or this was going to bring young people who were going to be beholden to the government that allowed them to come and therefore run to the polls and vote for them. I mean, really? Does it work that way?
No, I mean, and I think at the end of the day, this is, just kind of good intentions run amok, right? That I think the federal government at its core, and this goes back to the previous federal government, had a good idea of, again, so instead of having people come out at 28 or 29, and move to Canada, come here at 18 or 19, get your degree or diploma here, and you're going to have much better labor market outcomes. But I think the challenge was to go, okay, well, we're in control of that part. The provinces and municipal governments are in control of housing. Similarly, I think you have colleges saying, well, look,
Yeah.
we haven't got as much money from provincial governments recently. We need to pay the bills. This is a win-win situation where we can get a lot of money from international students, but also provide them with an education and so on. So I think that the challenge is that everyone in the system thought they were, for the most part, thought that they were acting fairly benevolently. But the problems in the system were somebody else's fault, right? Where
Yeah.
the colleges were saying, well, no, it's municipal zoning is the issue why we can't build enough housing. And then, municipalities might blame the provinces for downloading. The provinces say, well, no, the federal government runs the immigration system. It's not us. So you had three orders of government plus
Yeah.
a higher education system all pointing fingers
Pointing.
at each other.
Yeah.
And they all, at some level, had a point, right? That,
Yeah. No,
they
no, for
weren't.
sure.
So, and it's a classic Canadian problem where we have different orders of government, different actors who don't always play well with each other.
Yeah. So the problem is here, and there is no way that, and any economist and any house
No.
builder will tell you this, is that we can't move fast enough in the system to actually provide the homes, not only for new people here, but for existing young people that are growing up that can't afford to buy homes. So you can change the rules, but we're going to have a housing crisis with us for a while yet.
Yeah, I'm afraid so. And in fairness, it took us a generation to get into this mess, and it's probably going to take us a generation to get out. Unfortunately, and I say that as a parent of a teenager
Yeah.
who, like my daughter, to be able to have a home someday. This hole we've dug ourselves in, this mess is going to take years and years to address, and I think, I'm cautiously optimistic we can get there. We are, clearly we've made reforms. The federal government's made reforms to international students. We've got three orders of government trying to do something on the housing system. So, but I think we have to understand that this is going to be slow, incremental process. This is not going to be like one or two policy changes and then everything's fine.
Well, and I mean, I come from a rural part of the country anyway, so there are already issues. But I had a teacher friend tell me last week, literally, that they've got kids sitting in schools in Saskatoon that are
Mhm.
being looked after by a guidance counselor, or somebody's telling them to read a book or, watch something on their phone, because teachers are being sent out to hotels and other facilities where these other folks are living to try and give them some kind of education. So they're not getting that. The kids in regular school are being left on their own. And meanwhile, nobody can get a doctor. Like, this is serious stuff. I don't think we have 3 years or 5 years or 10 years to fix it before there's going to be some huge consequences.
Yeah, and that's, again, points to the lack of planning that,
Yeah.
if we are growing our population,
Yeah.
we grew our population by about 10% over just 4 years, but we didn't increase the number of students in medical schools by 10%
Right.
or do all of these other things. So, and I think that's the key where, if you're going to, increase your population by X%, whatever X is, you got to make sure all of those other things from teachers to doctors to hospitals or so on are growing at least that rate, and they haven't been, and we are
We've
seeing
got,
those
I
tensions.
think you wrote this in one of your pieces. We've got an additional roughly 3 million people that we know about in the last couple of years. And that's a huge number to try and accommodate.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. In the last year, we've added a population that's larger than Saskatchewan. Like we
Yeah.
are adding mid-sized provinces to Canada every year with population growth. So, that's going to change things. You can imagine if we start adding a million and a half people a year. The federal government says that the recent changes are going to drop that to zero for 3 years. We'll have to see whether or not that's the case. But absolutely, we just
But the
weren't
ones that
set
are
up.
here they're already here.
Yeah, well, that's just it. Yeah, and I mean, we have, the federal government is, making changes to the immigration, the permanent
Yeah.
residency system to lower those numbers, but also shift who gets permanent residency. Give it more to people who are already here, less to people who are currently overseas. But it is a challenge, and again, it comes back to the lack of planning. If the federal
Yeah.
government had decided 8 or 9 years ago that said, okay, you know what, by 2024, we're going to increase population growth to a million a year. That would have been a challenge, but if we kind of knew this was coming, everybody is like, okay, we could roll up our sleeves and everybody could start making changes. But when it's so unplanned and accidental, you just, whether it be school boards or the higher
Right.
education sector, so on, nobody has time to plan for that kind of thing.
So, I mean, what is your theory about it? I mean, why did the government think this was the thing to do, despite all advice to the contrary?
Well, I don't, to be honest, I don't think they anticipated the non-permanent residency growing quite a bit. And you look at things like StatsCan's population forecast, they weren't in there and so on. So I'd
Right.
actually ask a different question of is more like, how did they miss this?
Yes,
I think they should have seen this coming, even though that wasn't planned for. There were groups, I was writing about this back in 2019 before
exactly.
things really
Yeah.
exploded. People in the higher education system were as well saying, hey, like these enrollments are going up and up and up. I'll give you one classic example that I'm in London, I'm from London, Ontario,
Yeah.
and our official plan, which governs, how big the city grows, it had our population growing up, forecasted to go up at a slower rate than the number of students that the university and college were adding each year. So I'm looking at this going, okay, either you're suggesting to me that the rest of the city is going to depopulate
Yeah.
somehow, or
And that
or
nobody's
we've got a
coming.
disconnect here. But
Yeah.
yeah, and I think that's ultimately it. That it's a clear indication that the left hand and the right hand don't know what the other one's doing. I think that's essentially what happened here. It's just a lack of planning and forecasting.
Because the other signal that sends to the world is, and our reputation precedes us on this, that we're kind of the easy mark, which is why the Americans are so concerned that, come on in. And then we don't really pay that much attention to then who leaves and to where.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't send a great signal that we have our act together on this. And yeah, and even to the the potential people who want to come in as students, right? That I think we are sending a signal that we leave things to the last minute, and then we put in these sort of massive policy changes and create this whiplash. So absolutely, it does not send a great signal to the rest of the world that we're a country that plans well, that has our act together, or so on. Rather, we look like we're just kind of asleep at the wheel, and then once we wake up, do sort of a massive course correct.
Just want to step back a bit because much is made of it that when the prime minister was asked about his open borders immigration strategy way back when, he was talking about, a nation founded by European settlers is offensive. Old white stock Canadians are a relic. We need to replace them, and I'm going to. And so you see that, and then what that does to a country where the consensus on immigration has been strong. I mean, I come from a part of the world that is all immigrants, in terms of the development, the natives, the original indigenous people were a very small number of people in Saskatchewan, and we have huge Ukrainian populations and huge Polish populations and all of that have come and built this, and they're feeling really under threat. They're, as you say, even about your daughter, they were hoping for generational improvements for their kids, and now they've been told to get out of the way. It doesn't even really make sense, but it also really breaks down that principle on which we were founded and which everybody subscribed to.
Yeah, I do think it's a problem. And again, I keep coming back to this, but this sort of lack of planning, and
Yeah,
I keep saying that the biggest victims of all are the people who are kind of coming over, who are come here and are surprised to learn how expensive housing is, that
right.
they don't have the supports to look after them. And in my point of view, this I absolutely agree with the historical importance of immigration to our country. And my point is, like, if it's that important, then you got to spend the resources on it. You got to spend
Yeah.
the planning on it. Just saying, okay, we're gonna deregulate this thing, and whatever happens. I don't think is treating the immigration issue as seriously as it needs to be treated. And that's for somebody, and I will put this out there. I'm very pro immigration,
Yeah.
but being pro immigration means that you need to spend the time and the money and the resources to make the system work.
Well, I was reading a piece by Tasha Keratin the other day, earlier on in the month. Canada's become a nation of diasporas. Rather than wrapping ourselves in a common flag, we huddle in our enclaves: Muslim, Sikh, Hindu, Jewish. She goes through the long list. But everyone then in that situation is kind of the other. Um, that has a set of implications on themselves. But because well, let's just talk about that one first, because this goes back to the melting pot versus the
Mhm.
mosaic. And if you're going to bring these numbers in, we've got to have a different way of looking at integration and becoming part of this country. We need to say it out loud.
Yeah, well, I do think it's a challenge, and again, I do think part of what the federal government was trying to do, again, going not just this government, but the previous
Yeah,
one was trying to address that, right? That you get more integration by having people come in at 17 and spend
yeah,
4 years together at a college and university and so on. So I do think that is part of it. We are culturally different than the United States, and I don't think we're going to necessarily go to that model. But I certainly think, again, it just comes back to that planning. That if we sort of go, okay, this is what we want to be as a country, we can we can get there. But I agree with the overall point that it has more than just economic
right.
consequences. It affects how we view the immigration system. It affects our culture and so on, and we should take those things seriously.
I mean, we need to balance this too, and then I want to go kind of off on a little bit of another direction. But by 2030, Canadians age 65 and older will reach 9 million. That's going to be more than 20% of the population. The number of children is declining, headed for kind of 13% of the population. So, in other words, we have a lot of grandparents and not too many grandkids. And whether you like it or not, they're the ones that will be paying the bills. And so we need to rebalance that. But unless we're bringing in the right kind of people, the people our economy needs to deal with those issues of our own depopulation and an aging one, then we're just going to end up with more cost to a system that already can't afford it, et cetera, more resentment, and people that don't have work commit crime, and all of the things that go along with that.
Well, I do think it's one of the problems we've had over the last few years is we've kind of gotten away from a system that worked really well over the last 40 to 50 years, which is the point-based system, where to come over as a permanent residency, you get assigned a certain number of points based on your skills and
Yeah,
attributes, your ability to speak one of our official languages and so on. It was actually the envy of most of the world.
yeah,
And we've kind of gotten away with that, away from that. And again, I go back to the international student side where they're we had nothing similar when it came to coming over here as an international student, right? Where we didn't say, okay, like what are you studying? Until
Yeah,
recently, that wasn't or that didn't matter at all whether or not you get an international student visa. And the challenge there was then that created the conditions for colleges to go, okay, well, what's the cheapest thing we can offer?
right.
And 9 times out of 10, it was again these big Zoom courses
Yeah,
that were kind of like introduction to business fundamentals. And
which
I
is
teach at a business
waiting
school. I got
tables.
not.
Yeah,
Yeah, well, exactly. I teach at a business school. I have nothing, obviously nothing against the topic, but you go, okay, do we really need 150,000 people in Ontario studying bookkeeping
yeah,
when we know
yeah.
the shortages? They're in the trades, they're in the health sector, or so on. So I think that was one of the big problematic shifts we had, that we went away from the point-based system to going, okay, we'll just let colleges and universities figure it out. And we got this kind of skills mismatch where the folks that we were allowing colleges to bring in weren't necessarily the skills that we needed.
The other thing, and we're seeing it on the streets, and I just read a piece yesterday about, hold the phone here on bringing in more refugees, so-called, and that word was kind of in quotation marks, from Gaza and places where there are huge. I mean, we're seeing it on the streets of our country right now. The protests of people bringing new wars and old wars here, whether it's um, the Hindu Sikh communities, and the fights are bubbling out here on the streets. I think in part, I don't know what your theory is, because we can't accommodate, and because we haven't said, why are you coming? And because we've put more emphasis on living separate and apart rather than integrating in.
Well, I think that's a classic Canadian problem. So my family's from a community called Whaling Corners, Ontario, which is just outside of Lucan, Ontario. And
Yeah,
it is, if anybody knows anything about those communities, it's where the Donnelly Massacre happened 150 years ago. And this was classic old world, in this case, Ireland, some of those
yeah,
feuds coming over. So this is not necessarily
new.
anything new. And again, I grew up, my parents grew up in a area of southwestern Ontario where the Protestant kids and the Catholic kids often didn't talk to each other. Never the twain shall meet. So, I think this is always a challenge with integration or with immigration. I think there are ways that can be addressed. And I certainly don't think the answer should be that we don't help the world's most vulnerable. I'm fully supportive of part of my family's Ukrainian. I'm
Yeah,
definitely supportive of bringing in people who have been affected by that war, but you got to make the investments. You got to make
yeah,
the investments in making sure that those people have somewhere to live, education, social support, like all the kind of wraparound supports you need. That if you've got somebody who's been terrorized by the effect of war for multiple years, they're going to have mental health challenges. There's
yeah.
nothing around that, and we need to be able to support these folks.
But when you look at the polling numbers on this, I mean, it's now um, upwards of 60, I think 60% of people have some real concerns, but they're also distinguishing. They're kind of saying to the pollsters, yes, you bring the Ukrainians in, not sure about Syrians or the folks from Gaza. Like, people are starting to make distinctions because of the impact upon arrival. Like, this is nuance. This isn't just, I love immigration or I hate immigration. This is, let's be more intelligent and focused about what we're doing. Or, as you say, like, let's think it through before we do it.
Yeah, no, I think we do need to have planning. We do need to, take the pulse of Canadians, but I would hate to ignore parts of the world that have conflicts.
Yeah,
I think Canada needs to be a good actor on the global stage. It's sort of recognize that people around the world are suffering, and I think we need to do what we can. But again, that goes into making those investments and making sure that
yeah,
people can succeed and not just go, okay, well. the path to salvation is just okay. Let's open this up, and then whatever happens, happens. You got to be able to put in the hours, put in the money to make this work.
Are we going to have to send some people home, and do we know how to do that?
Yeah, I do think I do think that will happen. And that does happen. People overstay their visas and so on. But I also suggest that in many cases, the opposite are happening. That people are actually leaving before their visas are expiring, and we're seeing that in Southern Ontario, where international students arrive. Kind of realize that they've been sold a false bill of goods, that the cost of living is too high here, and going home. So the producer of our podcast, Meredith Martin, had
Mhm.
tenants living with her from Eastern Europe, who ended up just saying like, no, this is terrible.
This
I
is
can't make a
not what
go of
we
it.
were told. Yeah.
It was not it's not what we were told, and my kids can't get access to healthcare, and I'm going broke here on rent, and even though was very skilled in my profession, those that's not recognized here. So I think we also see some of the opposite happening, of people actually going, you know what, Canada is not what I was told. I'm going to go try my chances somewhere else. That might change it a little bit with the situation in the United States, because I think a
Hmm.
lot of them were going to the US and now
Yeah.
going, maybe not. So we'll have to see. But I think many of them are voluntarily leaving just because of the high cost of living here.
So are we, in a sense, losing the people that we should have wanted to attract in the first place, the people that were coming here because they had a work ethic and a dream and all of that, and they're going, wow, this is not what I was promised, so I want to go somewhere else. And if they're reluctant about the US because of the situation now and don't want to go home, then we've got a lot of people just kind of treading water.
I suppose that's possible. Though I would say that most people who come here, and again, the bulk on the non-permanent resident side was international students, right?
Yeah. That's,
you don't pay fifty thousand
yeah.
dollars a year to be here,
Yeah.
unless you've got
You have
something.
those resources.
You have those resources, but also you're planning to make it back, and then some. Like the folks coming over see it as an investment, and they want to make this work, and some of them are able to, but unfortunately, I think a lot of them are finding that what, they're just not getting the returns. They're not able,
That's what
after
I
the
mean
cost of
about the
living.
balance. So if the
Yeah.
folks that came with that and had the means are the ones that are going to flee or leave because it wasn't as advertised, but then you've got a whole lot of people still here who came through the system that are not yet contributing, which is becoming a huge cost on a lot of systems, provincial, municipal, federal, healthcare, housing, education, that really is where the problem begins.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a challenge. I do think that the vast majority of folks who come here, are either contributing or at least trying
Yeah,
to contribute. Again, just because the barriers to getting here and the costs to getting here are so high that you're not going to make that move
yeah.
unless you see something on the other side of it.
What's the what's the podcast about? The missing middle.
So the missing middle is a podcast about the young urban middle class. So the missing middle is a kind of play on words, that the missing middle is a type of housing, kind of mid-rise housing that we haven't built much in this country,
Yeah.
but and a larger theme is the fact that the middle class, particularly in our cities, in particular among our young, is eroding. That kind of middle class lifestyle that I came to expect, and generations before me came to expect, that our younger folks are increasingly being locked out of it unless they have significant parental support.
This is, we're seeing that, and we saw that realignment south of the border where, where the Republicans became the voice of the working class because that was the huge bundle. The middle class is in trouble. They're either getting really rich or they're getting poor.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I don't think Canada is immune to that. You know, one of the things I've seen, I've taught fourth year undergraduates at Ivy Business School for about 20 years now. So I've
Yeah.
I spent the last 23 years or so hanging out with 23-year-olds, and I have seen a marked shift in their opinion and outlook. It's more polarized. There are fewer centrists among this group than there used to be. You know, they're one way or another, you know, kind of wanting to burn down the system a little bit, and that causes some polarization in some views. But in general, yeah, they are less optimistic about the future than the cohort 5 or 10 years ago. They're definitely less interested in staying in Southern Ontario. They don't think they can make a go of it here. And yeah, they're just less optimistic about the future. And I'd love to be able to tell them that they're wrong, but I really can't. I think they're smarter than they get credit for. They know exactly what's going on, and they're not happy about it.
And more pragmatic in the sense of, okay, if it won't work here, I'll have to go where it will.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they are one of the most pragmatic cohorts I've seen in my career. That they are, um, you know, I would say 5 or 10 years ago, they would just look for the best job possible. I just want the best job out of university, and I'll figure out everything else. And now they're really doing this. Okay, well, yeah, I could make like X amount of dollars in Toronto, but you know, I could make a little bit less and move in Edmonton, but maybe that's better because the cost of living is
Yeah.
lower, or maybe I should consider the state. So they do all of this kind of mental calculations, these very pragmatic calculations that they really weren't doing, say, 10 years ago, when they're just like, okay, you know, what's my dream job? Okay, I'm gonna take whatever's closest to that. You know,
Yeah.
it's a very practical cohort.
Well, and also, some, at least this is my experience with that, Jan, which is, you know, less about the big job and the title and more about if I'm going to have a family and kids, I want to be somewhere where there's a hockey rink that I can afford to go to.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because they are looking for that. So it's not just okay, can I live here and maybe live in a 500 square foot
Yeah.
condo in a tower somewhere? They are absolutely making that calculation. I think it's why so many of them are leaving Southern Ontario, either going to the U.S. or going to Alberta, going to
Yeah.
Atlantic Canada, and so on, because they're like, well, look, if I can actually afford a 3 bedroom home if I move to Edmonton. I can be within 10 minutes of the arena. You know, I can have a backyard for my kids, that kind of thing,
Yeah.
where I know even in the GTA that's not possible. So absolutely, they're looking for that quality of life. They want to. Many of them want to be able to raise kids, have kids, and they're going, okay, I can't make a go of it here.
Yeah. We'll talk about that whole thing another day, but I'm really glad I asked you about the podcast because that's a an interesting place to finish in this whole context of our discussion. Thanks so much, Mike. Really good to meet you and hear you on this.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm going to check it out. An economist. He's with the executive in residence. That's a good title, actually. The Smart Prosperity Institute. Is that a think tank?
Yeah, it's a think tank here in the University of Ottawa.
Yeah. Okay, so that's great. Really good. We'll talk again soon. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you.
That's it. Great. And thank you for being with us for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. We'll talk to you soon.